You don't belong in first class. The words didn't echo, but they landed heavy enough to tilt the entire cabin. Naomi Carter didn't look up at first. She was seated in 2A, window side, legs crossed, a black hoodie pulled over a plain white tee, dark jeans, no jewelry, no visible signal of wealth. Just another passenger to anyone who judged by fabric instead of facts. Outside the oval window, Chicago's O'Hare runway shimmered under late afternoon light, heat rippling above the concrete in thin waves. Inside the cabin, the air was cool, controlled, filtered, quiet, almost too quiet. Emily Brooks stood in the aisle, posture tight, tablet pressed against her hip like a shield. 34, senior flight attendant, 10 years with Skybridge Airlines. She had perfected the polite smile that never reached her eyes. Right now, she wasn't smiling. "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass again," she said, tone clipped, professional on the surface, something else underneath. Naomi lifted her gaze slowly. Not defensive, not confused, just steady. She had boarded 20 minutes earlier. The scanner had flashed green. The gate agent had nodded. Seat 2A had been printed in bold black ink on her pass. Nothing about it had been unclear. "You already scanned it," Naomi replied calmly. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It simply existed. A few rows back, a man in a navy suit glanced up from his phone. Across the aisle, a mother traveling with her teenage daughter leaned slightly closer, sensing friction before words sharpened. Emily's jaw tightened. "There's been a mix-up," she said. "This seat has been reassigned." Naomi looked down at the armrest, then back up. "Reassigned to who?" she asked. A pause, just long enough to be noticed. Emily tapped at her tablet screen. The device reflected in her glasses. "The system doesn't show your name attached to 2A, she said. Naomi didn't move. Didn't argue. "Check the manifest," she answered. Her tone was neutral, but the air shifted a degree. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But something about her composure felt anchored, like she had planted herself there on purpose. 15 minutes earlier, when Naomi stepped onto Flight 227 bound for Los Angeles, she had chosen to blend in. No assistant. No entourage. No tailored blazer. She had walked down the jet bridge alone, sneakers quiet against industrial carpet, carrying a slim leather tote. She preferred it that way. When you own 62% of a company, you don't always announce it. Sometimes you listen first. Sometimes you watch. Sometimes you test the temperature of the room without anyone realizing you're the thermostat. In the galley, 2 junior crew members had exchanged a look when they saw her take 2A. It was subtle, quick, but not invisible. Naomi had noticed. She always noticed. Emily's voice cut back in. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step into the aisle." Naomi's eyes flicked briefly to the boarding pass tucked neatly into the seat back pocket. "For what reason?" she asked. "Verification." The word hung between them like a thin thread stretched too tight. A young trainee, barely 22, name tag reading Maya Collins, hovered near the curtain dividing first class from economy. She had watched Naomi's ticket scan green at the gate. She had seen the confirmation with her own eyes. Now she looked uncertain, fingers brushing the edge of her uniform jacket. "I saw it scan," Maya offered softly. Emily shot her a glance sharp enough to silence a room. "Stay out of this," she murmured. Naomi's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. Not aggression. Alignment. Like a spine straightening. She stood slowly, careful, deliberate, giving no one the satisfaction of haste. Around her, seat belts clicked open. Not in protest. In curiosity. Phones began to rise. Not fully, not obviously, but halfway. Emily stepped closer. "You need to understand," she said, lowering her voice. "We've had incidents before. People trying to access seats they didn't pay for." Naomi met her eyes. "And you decided I fit that profile?" The question was quiet. It didn't accuse. It illuminated. Emily inhaled. "I decided to follow protocol." Naomi nodded once. "Then follow it completely." The captain's voice crackled faintly over the intercom from the cockpit. Something about departure delay due to a minor paperwork issue. The irony hovered in the air, unnoticed by most. Emily tapped her tablet again, frowning. "Your name isn't here." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "What name are you looking for?" That was when Captain Daniel Reeves emerged from behind the cockpit door. Tall, silver-haired, authority worn like a tailored coat. He surveyed the scene quickly. What seems to be the issue, he asked. Emily answered before Naomi could speak. Passenger in 2A cannot be verified on the manifest. Daniel looked at Naomi, taking in hoodie, jeans, unadorned simplicity. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to cooperate. Naomi's voice remained level. I am cooperating. A beat. Are you? The cabin felt smaller, pressurized beyond altitude. A businessman 2 rows back muttered under his breath. This is ridiculous. A flight attendant from the rear approached, whispering something about full capacity and VIP travelers on standby. Daniel's expression hardened subtly. If there's a discrepancy, we can resolve it off the aircraft, he said. Naomi's lips curved, not into a smile, not quite, but into something knowing. Resolve it here, she replied. In front of everyone. Maya shifted her weight again. Captain, she said carefully. I saw her boarding pass. It was valid. Daniel didn't look at her. We'll handle this, he answered. Naomi felt it then. Not the tension, not the scrutiny, but the memory. She was 19 again, standing in a regional airline office in Atlanta, resume in hand, wearing her best navy blazer. The recruiter had skimmed her file, nodded politely, then said, We're looking for a different image. Different image. She had carried those words like a folded note in her pocket for years. Not heavy, just present. That rejection had fueled something. Business school, venture capital, strategic acquisitions. One airline at a time. Until Skybridge had become hers. Not inherited, not gifted, but built through calculated ownership. Back in seat 2A, she blinked the memory away. The present was sharper. Emily stepped closer again, voice tightening. Ma'am, you need to step aside. Naomi didn't move. Or what? She asked. Not challenging. Clarifying. Daniel sighed, impatience creeping in. We can't delay 143 passengers over this. Naomi glanced around the cabin slowly. Then let's not. Silence. 5 seconds. Long enough to count heartbeats. Emily reached toward Naomi's arm. Not violently, not aggressively, but firmly enough to assert control. Naomi gently removed her arm from the contact. Don't, she said quietly. Not loud. But it carried. That was the moment the cabin lights flickered, not dramatically, just a subtle pulse as systems recalibrated for departure. Naomi slipped one hand into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't hide the motion. She didn't dramatize it. She tapped a single contact. Rachel, she said when the line connected. Her voice remained steady, unhurried. Activate internal audit protocol. Flight 227. First class. Emily scoffed lightly. Daniel folded his arms. Ma'am, this isn't going to help you. Naomi's gaze lifted from her phone to his face. Calm. Direct. It's not for me. Across the aisle, the teenage girl whispered to her mother. Something's about to happen. And she was right. Because within seconds, every crew tablet in the cabin buzzed simultaneously. A notification none of them had seen before. Access restricted. Supervisor override initiated. Emily's eyes widened. Daniel's posture shifted. Naomi slipped her phone back into her pocket. Check the manifest again, she said softly. The words weren't a demand. They were an invitation. And as Emily stared down at her locked screen, the realization began to dawn. Not loudly, not explosively, but like a door quietly unlocking from the inside. Emily stared at her tablet as if it had betrayed her. The screen that moments ago displayed passenger assignments now showed a red banner across the top. Access restricted. Supervisor override initiated. Her fingers tapped the glass once, twice, harder the third time, as though pressure might reverse authority. It did not. Captain Daniel Reeves felt his own device vibrate in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out slowly, reading the same notification. His expression shifted from irritation to confusion, then to something quieter. Concern. The cabin, which had been filled with whispers seconds earlier, went still. Naomi Carter did not raise her voice. She did not smirk. She simply resumed her seat in 2A, folding her hands lightly in her lap, as if this were an ordinary delay. Check the manifest again, she repeated, not as a command, but as a suggestion grounded in certainty. Daniel cleared his throat. Ma'am, he began, attempting to reclaim tone. This appears to be a technical malfunction. Naomi tilted her head slightly. It is not a malfunction, she replied. It is a safeguard. Maya Collins looked from Naomi to the captain and back again. The young trainee's breathing had grown shallow. She sensed the shift before fully understanding it. Across the aisle, the mother with the teenage daughter lowered her phone just enough to whisper. She knew this would happen. The businessman too rose back, leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching Daniel rather than Naomi. Authority, after all, had always worn stripes on shoulders. Until it did not. Emily tried to step away toward the galley, but her tablet chimed again. A second notification. All crew accounts temporarily suspended pending verification. Contact Operations Control. Her face drained of color. Captain, she said, voice lower now, stripped of edge. This is not just mine. Daniel checked his device once more. The cockpit door behind him remained closed, but the co-pilot's voice came through his earpiece faintly, asking about the delay. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Naomi with a new calculation. Who are you? He asked. The question was direct, but the tone had changed. It no longer carried dismissal. It carried doubt. Naomi met his eyes without flinching. You have my name, she said. It was on the boarding pass you refused to read properly. Daniel inhaled slowly. Ma'am, if this is some kind of corporate complaint, Naomi interrupted him gently. It is not a complaint. Silence fell again. The kind of silence that has weight. In the cockpit, system panels began flashing advisory messages indicating that departure clearance had been temporarily paused by operations. Daniel's radio crackled with a message from ground control requesting confirmation of delay reason. The captain felt something unfamiliar press against his confidence. Loss of information. He turned to Emily. Did you delete anything from the manifest? The question landed harder than intended. Emily's eyes widened. No, she said quickly. Too quickly. Maya swallowed. She had seen Emily earlier in the galley tapping through seating assignments after Naomi sat down. At the time, it had seemed routine. Now it felt deliberate. Naomi observed the exchange without expression. She had seen that motion too. She saw everything. 15 minutes before boarding, inside Skybridge's downtown headquarters 40 miles away, Naomi had stood in a glass conference room reviewing a report. 3 anonymous complaints filed within the past quarter. Each one describing subtle profiling in premium cabins. Each one dismissed internally due to lack of evidence. Naomi had not confronted the board. She had not sent a memo. Instead, she had booked a seat. Hoodie instead of blazer. Economy shoes instead of executive heels. Visibility without announcement. It was never about catching someone in a dramatic act. It was about watching what happened when power appeared absent. Back in the cabin, Daniel straightened his posture. Ground control is asking why we are not pushing back, he said, attempting to regain rhythm. Naomi nodded once. You may tell them that internal review is in progress. The phrase unsettled him more than shouting would have. Internal review. Emily repeated, barely audible. Naomi looked at her fully now. Not with anger. With clarity. Skybridge Airlines maintains a real-time oversight protocol for customer experience compliance, she said evenly. When triggered, it restricts access until senior leadership verifies cabin conditions. Maya's eyes widened. She had heard of the protocol during training. Most employees believed it was theoretical. No one had ever seen it activated mid-flight. That protocol requires executive authorization, Daniel said slowly. Naomi's lips curved faintly. Correct. A long pause followed. Outside the window, baggage carts rolled past. A fuel truck idled 30 feet away. The runway lights flickered in the distance. Inside the aircraft, 143 passengers waited for resolution. Naomi reached into her hoodie pocket once more and removed her phone. She tapped the screen, then held it out slightly so that Daniel could see. A video call was active. On the screen, Rachel Donovan, Chief Operations Officer of Skybridge Airlines, appeared composed and alert. Behind her, a wall of monitors displayed live operational data. Captain Reeves, Rachel said calmly through the speaker. This is Operations Control. Please confirm cabin status. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath years of routine authority. This is Captain Reeves, he replied carefully. We have a passenger dispute regarding seat assignment. Rachel did not look surprised. We are aware, she answered. Please return seat 2A to its original designation immediately. Emily's breathing quickened. Original designation? She whispered. Rachel continued, her tone unwavering. Seat 2A is assigned to Ms. Naomi Carter. Daniel glanced from the phone screen to the woman seated in 2A. Hoodie, jeans, steady gaze. And who? he began cautiously. Is Miss Carter? The question felt almost rhetorical now. Rachel did not hesitate. She is the majority shareholder and chief executive officer of Skybridge Airlines. The cabin did not erupt. It did not gasp loudly. Instead, it absorbed the information like a wave traveling through water. Passengers looked at one another. The businessman exhaled softly. The teenage girl whispered, I knew it. Emily stepped back as if distance could undo earlier assumptions. That is not possible, she said faintly. Naomi ended the call without flourish and placed the phone back into her pocket. She did not stand. She did not lecture. You based authority on presentation, she said quietly, addressing no one and everyone at once. That is not protocol. That is bias. Daniel's face tightened, but not in anger. In recognition, the co-pilot's voice came again through his earpiece, this time sharper, asking for direction. Daniel responded slowly. Departure delayed due to executive audit. The words tasted unfamiliar. Emily looked at Maya, then at Naomi. I was following procedure, she insisted, though the conviction had drained from her voice. Naomi nodded slightly. Procedure does not include erasing a passenger's name from the manifest. Emily froze. I did not. Naomi held her gaze. System logs do not lie. In operations control, Rachel's voice returned through the cabin speaker as she connected the aircraft audio. Crew members Brooks and Reeves, your access credentials have been temporarily suspended pending review. Please remain in place. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. Not in defeat. In recalibration. He had flown for 23 years. He had believed experience insulated him from oversight. Yet here he stood, corrected not by turbulence, but by accountability. Maya felt her heart pounding. She had chosen a career in aviation because she believed in precision, in fairness measured by weight and balance. She had not expected that fairness would require courage on day 3 of her independent rotation. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat. The movement was small, but the atmosphere responded. This is not about humiliation, she said evenly. It is about correction. The mother across the aisle nodded quietly. The businessman leaned back in his seat, watching history unfold at 30,000 feet above ground level, even though the aircraft had not yet left the gate. Daniel straightened again, but this time without defensiveness. What would you like us to do? He asked. Naomi considered him for a moment. Acknowledge the mistake, she said. Then fix it. Emily's lips parted, but no words came. The intercom chimed as operations control announced that a replacement senior crew member was en route to the aircraft. Outside, a ground supervisor approached the jet bridge with urgency. The cabin, once charged with accusation, now held something different. Reflection. Naomi looked out the window briefly. The runway stretched wide and open. Planes moved because systems aligned. When one part failed, it was corrected before takeoff. That was how safety worked. That was how leadership should work. She turned back toward Daniel and Emily. You mistook quiet for powerlessness, she said calmly. That assumption grounded this flight. And as the jet bridge door opened to admit a compliance officer in a Navy blazer, it became clear that the real departure would not be measured in miles, but in accountability. The compliance officer who stepped on a flight 227 did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She carried a Navy portfolio tucked under one arm and a silver identification badge that reflected the overhead lights as she entered first class. Her name read Angela Martinez, Senior Compliance Director, Skybridge Airlines. She paused at the edge of the curtain dividing first class from the rest of the cabin and took in the scene in one quiet sweep. Naomi Carter remained seated in 2A, composed, hands resting lightly against the armrests. Captain Daniel Reeves stood in the aisle, posture controlled but no longer dominant. Emily Brooks hovered near the galley entrance, tablet useless in her hand, eyes flickering between the passengers and the compliance officer. 143 people watched in silence. Angela spoke calmly. Captain Reeves, Ms. Brooks, you are relieved of active duty pending immediate review. The words were not loud, but they carried authority that did not require emphasis. Daniel nodded once, the motion stiff but dignified. Emily swallowed hard. Relieved? She repeated, as if the term had not fully translated. Angela did not shift tone. Temporarily removed from operational control. Replacement crew is en route. You will remain on board until escorted. Naomi did not look triumphant. She did not fold her arms or lean back in satisfaction. She simply observed. Correction was never about spectacle for her. It was about structure. Daniel exhaled slowly. "This is highly irregular," he said, though the protest lacked heat. Angela met his gaze evenly. "So is altering a passenger manifest." The words settled heavily between them. Emily's shoulders tightened. "I did not alter anything," she said quickly. Angela opened her portfolio and removed a printed sheet. At 4:12 p.m. Central Standard Time, the seat assignment for 2A was manually accessed. At 4:14 p.m., the passenger name was cleared. At 4:15 p.m., it was marked as pending reassignment. Angela's eyes lifted from the page. "Your credentials initiated that sequence." The cabin did not gasp. It did not need to. Evidence has a way of silencing denial without force. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, not to interrupt, but to anchor the moment. She had expected resistance. She had not expected surprise. Daniel turned toward Emily slowly. The look was not accusatory. It was tired. "Why?" he asked quietly. Emily's eyes glistened. But she did not cry. "I thought it was a mistake," she said. "I thought she did not belong in that seat." Naomi's gaze sharpened, but her voice remained calm. "Based on what?" she asked. The question hung in the cabin like a mirror no one wanted to face. Emily hesitated. Words formed and dissolved before leaving her mouth. "Presentation," she finally said. The honesty was accidental. It was also complete. Angela closed the folder. "Skybridge policy is explicit," she said evenly. "Seat designation is determined by verified purchase and manifest confirmation, not perception." Maya Collins stood near the curtain, fingers clasped together. She had chosen this career believing that protocol meant fairness. Watching this unfold, she realized fairness required courage as much as regulation. Naomi turned slightly toward her. "Maya," she said gently. The young trainee startled at hearing her name. "You spoke earlier," Naomi continued. "You said you saw the boarding pass scan green." Maya nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "And yet you hesitated," Naomi said, not accusing, simply observing. Maya lowered her eyes. "I was not sure if it was my place." Naomi studied her for a moment. "Leadership is not a title," she said quietly. "It is a choice made in uncomfortable moments." The mother across the aisle squeezed her daughter's hand. The businessman too rose back, leaned back in his seat, arms folded, absorbing each word as if attending a lecture at 30,000 feet. Angela's radio crackled softly as ground operations confirmed the arrival of a relief captain and senior attendant. The jet bridge remained connected. The engines remained silent. Naomi glanced toward the window again. Outside, another aircraft rolled slowly down the runway, lifting into the sky with quiet confidence. Systems aligned. Checks completed. No one questioned its right to depart. Inside this cabin, departure had become conditional on integrity. Daniel straightened his uniform jacket. "Ms. Carter," he began carefully, the honorific no longer withheld. "I have flown for 23 years. I have never been accused of bias." Naomi nodded once. "And I have led this airline for 6, she replied. "This is the first time I have triggered a live audit." The words were not a threat. They were perspective. Emily's hands trembled slightly, though she tried to steady them. "I thought I was protecting the brand," she said. Naomi's eyes held hers. "You were protecting an image," she answered. "There is a difference." Angela stepped aside as the jet bridge door opened again. A new captain entered, uniform pressed, expression alert but measured. Behind him, a senior flight attendant with calm eyes and steady posture followed. They paused respectfully at the entrance to first class. Angela addressed them briefly. "Captain Owens, you will assume command of Flight 227. Ms. Reynolds, you will oversee cabin operations." They nodded in unison. Daniel removed his cap slowly. The motion felt heavier than fabric should weigh. He handed it to Angela without resistance. Emily stepped back toward the galley, her earlier certainty replaced with quiet reckoning. Naomi watched without expression. She did not seek apology. She sought correction. Captain Owens approached the aisle near 2A and inclined his head toward Naomi. "Ms. Carter," he said evenly, "we apologize for the delay. We are prepared to resume boarding procedures as soon as you approve." Naomi regarded him calmly. "Approval." The word felt ironic. "Proceed when compliance confirms clearance," she replied. Angela checked her device, then nodded. "Clearance granted. Manifest restored. Credentials updated." The new crew moved efficiently, resetting what had been disrupted. Passengers adjusted in their seats. The low murmur returned, but it carried a different tone now. Not curiosity. Reflection. Naomi remained seated as the aircraft prepared for pushback once more. The mother across the aisle leaned slightly forward. "Thank you," she said softly. Naomi met her eyes. "For what?" she asked gently. "For not letting it slide," the woman replied. Naomi considered that. For years, she had let small things slide. Glances, comments, doubts disguised as policy. She had told herself it was strategic, that battles required timing. Today, timing had arrived unannounced. Maya stepped closer to a voice tentative but sincere. "Miss Carter, I am sorry I did not speak louder." Naomi's expression softened slightly. "You spoke," she said. "Next time, do it sooner." The engines began to hum as ground crew signaled clearance. The aircraft pushed back from the gate slowly, the motion smooth and deliberate. Inside the cabin, nothing appeared unusual to someone boarding late. Yet everything had shifted. Emily and Daniel remained seated near the rear, awaiting escort upon landing. They did not argue. They did not protest. They sat with the weight of correction settling quietly on their shoulders. Naomi looked ahead as the plane taxied toward the runway. She felt no surge of victory, no rush of triumph. Only alignment. The runway stretched long and open. Captain Owen's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are number 3 for departure. We will be in the air shortly." Naomi closed her eyes briefly as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. She remembered being 19, standing outside an office that had told her she did not match their image. She remembered walking away without argument, promising herself she would build something that did not measure belonging by appearance. Now, as the wheels lifted from the ground and Chicago's skyline shrank beneath them, she felt that promise settle fully into place. Not as revenge, not as spectacle, but as structure. The cabin leveled at cruising altitude. Seatbelt signs dimmed. Service resumed under new leadership. Naomi opened her laptop and began reviewing the next compliance report in her inbox. Reform did not end at one incident. It required continuation. As the aircraft cut through the evening sky at 500 miles per hour, one truth lingered quietly in first class. Power does not need to announce itself. It only needs to show up when it matters. And today it had. At 37,000 feet, the cabin lights dimmed to a softer glow, and the tension that had once gripped first class began to settle into something quieter, heavier, more reflective. Naomi Carter did not celebrate. She did not replay the confrontation in her mind. She opened her laptop instead, the soft click of the hinge sounding louder than usual in the stillness. Outside the window, the sky stretched endless and dark blue, the horizon bending gently against the curve of the earth. Inside, the atmosphere had changed in a way that no altitude could measure. Captain Owens moved through the cockpit checklist with steady precision, while Senior Attendant Reynolds began beverage service with calm professionalism. The plane felt balanced again, but balance does not erase memory. 2 rows behind the curtain, Daniel Reeves sat without his captain's jacket. His shoulders, once squared with authority, now rested lower, as if gravity had increased only for him. Across from him, Emily Brooks stared at her hands folded tightly in her lap. Neither of them spoke. Words would not reverse what had already been documented. Naomi sensed their presence behind her, not with resentment, but with awareness. Accountability had landed. It would travel with them. To Los Angeles. Maya Collins approached 2A carefully, holding a tray of sparkling water and orange juice. Her steps were steadier now than before takeoff. "Ms. Carter," she said softly, "would you like anything?" Naomi looked up from her screen and offered a faint smile. "Water is fine," she replied. Maya placed the glass gently on the tray table. "I have been thinking," she added quietly, "about what you said, about leadership being a choice." Naomi studied her for a moment. "And what did you decide?" she asked. Maya drew a slow breath. "That I do not want to hesitate next time." Naomi nodded once. "Then you have already learned something most people avoid." The mother across the aisle leaned forward slightly. "May I say something?" she asked. Naomi turned her attention toward her. "Of course," she replied. The woman glanced at her daughter before continuing. "My daughter is applying to colleges this year. She wants to study aerospace engineering." I told her she might have to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. Watching you today reminded me that sometimes it is not about working twice as hard. It is about refusing to shrink. Naomi held the girl's gaze. Do not shrink, she said calmly. Design the system instead. The girl nodded, eyes wide with something like inspiration. Further back in the cabin, a quiet murmur moved through the passengers as phones buzzed with messages from ground control and social media notifications. Though no one had filmed aggressively, fragments of the confrontation had already begun circulating among those on board. The businessman too rose back, glanced at his screen, and then at Naomi. News travels fast, he said softly. Naomi did not look concerned. Truth travels faster, she replied. In the rear cabin, Daniel shifted slightly in his seat as a ground liaison connected through the in-flight communication system. The message was brief. He and Emily would be met upon landing by corporate representatives for formal review. No accusations. No spectacle. Just procedure. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, remembering the first time he stepped into a cockpit at 25 years old, believing merit alone defined aviation. He had not considered how perception might distort merit. Across the aisle, Emily finally spoke, her voice low and uneven. I thought I knew what authority looked like, she said, almost to herself. Daniel did not respond immediately. When he did, his tone carried something that had not been present before. Authority is not what we see, he said quietly. It is what we respect without condition. Back in first class, Senior Attendant Reynolds completed service and approached Naomi with professional courtesy. Ms. Carter, she said evenly. Operations Control has arranged a press statement for tomorrow morning. They would like your input. Naomi closed her laptop slowly. There will be no press statement, she replied. Reynolds paused. None. Naomi shook her head slightly. We will issue an internal memo instead. Reform does not need a spotlight. It needs consistency. Reynolds inclined her head. Understood. The engines hummed steadily as the aircraft continued westward at nearly 500 miles per hour. The sky outside deepened into indigo. Naomi leaned back into her seat, eyes tracing the faint reflection of her own silhouette against the glass. She remembered sitting in the back of a different aircraft years ago, watching executives board first class without once looking behind them. She had promised herself she would build something different. Not louder, not flashier, just fairer. Her phone vibrated lightly in her pocket. A message from Rachel Donovan appeared on the screen. Board has requested emergency session at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Full support confirmed. Naomi typed a brief response. Proceed with policy revision draft. Emphasis on live audit transparency. She slid the phone back into her pocket. The businessman leaned across the aisle slightly. May I ask you something? He said. Naomi nodded. Why did you not reveal who you were immediately? He asked. Naomi considered the question carefully. Because if respect depends on title, she answered, then it is not respect. It is performance. The cabin fell quiet again, not with tension, but with contemplation. Maya stood near the galley, replaying the sequence in her mind. She had felt small when Emily dismissed her earlier. She no longer felt small. She felt responsible. Responsibility carried weight, but it also carried direction. As the plane began its gradual descent toward Los Angeles, the captain's voice filled the cabin once more. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened. Naomi fastened hers without distraction. She glanced briefly toward the rear of the cabin. Daniel met her gaze for a moment and inclined his head slightly. It was not an apology spoken aloud, but it was acknowledgement. Emily looked forward, eyes rimmed with fatigue, understanding now that presentation had never been protection. The wheels touched down smoothly on the runway at Los Angeles International Airport. The reverse thrust roared briefly, then softened as the aircraft slowed. Passengers began gathering their belongings in silence. No one rushed the aisle. No one treated the landing as routine. Something had shifted beyond seat assignments. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Naomi remained seated. She allowed others to stand first. Leadership did not require standing ahead of anyone. It required standing when necessary. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Captain Owens opened the cockpit door and stepped into the aisle. Ms. Carter, he said respectfully. Thank you for your patience today. Naomi nodded. Thank you for restoring alignment, she replied. The jet bridge connected with a muted thud. Outside, Two corporate representatives waited near the entrance, holding folders and neutral expressions. Daniel and Emily rose slowly from their seats, not escorted by force, but guided by consequence. As they walked past first class, Daniel paused briefly beside 2A. "I will reflect on this," he said quietly. Naomi met his gaze. "Reflection is the beginning," she replied. Emily stopped a step behind him. "I did not intend harm," she said, voice strained but sincere. Naomi answered evenly. "Intent does not erase impact, but accountability can rebuild trust." Emily nodded once, absorbing the weight of that distinction. They continued forward, stepping onto the jet bridge without resistance. Passengers began filing out behind them, some offering subtle nods to Naomi as they passed. The mother and her daughter lingered for a moment. "We will not shrink," the girl said softly. Naomi smiled faintly. "Good," she replied. When the cabin finally emptied, Maya approached once more. "I hope to earn leadership someday," she said. Naomi stood from her seat, smoothing her hoodie as she did. "Then start now," she answered. She stepped into the aisle, not as a passenger reclaiming a seat, but as a leader reaffirming structure. Outside the aircraft, the California sun glowed against the glass terminal walls. Naomi walked forward calmly, knowing tomorrow would bring meetings, revisions, policy drafts, and long discussions about culture. Reform was not a single flight. It was an ongoing trajectory. And as she exited the plane she owned without announcing it again, one truth remained steady in the air behind her. When power is quiet but firm, systems learn to listen. The California air felt different when Naomi Carter stepped out of the jet bridge. It was warmer than Chicago, but that was not what she noticed. She noticed the stillness. Not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from consequence settling into place. Two corporate representatives stood near the terminal entrance exactly where Angela Martinez had said they would be. Both wore navy suits. Both held slim tablets instead of clipboards. Neither looked surprised to see her. Naomi adjusted the strap of her leather tote on her shoulder and walked toward them at an even pace. She did not rush. She did not slow. Daniel Reeves and Emily Brooks were already a few feet ahead, standing near the gate counter under the bright terminal lights. Without their uniforms framed by authority, they looked different. Smaller, perhaps. Or maybe just human. One of the representatives, a tall man with silver-framed glasses, spoke first. "Ms. Carter," he said respectfully. "Ground review team is prepared. Conference room B12. Naomi nodded once. "Proceed," she replied. She did not look back at the plane. Aircraft were built to move forward. So were systems. Inside conference room B12, the lighting was neutral and the glass walls transparent. Nothing about the meeting would be hidden. Daniel and Emily sat on one side of the long table. Angela Martinez stood near the head, tablet open. Rachel Donovan appeared on the wall screen through secure video link from headquarters. Naomi took the seat at the center, not at the head. Leadership did not require elevation above the table. It required clarity within it. No one spoke immediately. The quiet was deliberate. Finally, Rachel's voice filled the room. "This session is being recorded for internal review and policy assessment," she said evenly. "Captain Reeves, Ms. Brooks, you are here to provide formal explanation regarding today's incident." Daniel folded his hands in front of him. His voice was steady, but lower than before. "I allowed assumption to override verification," he said. "That is my responsibility." It was not defensive. It was factual. Rachel nodded slightly on screen. "And you, Ms. Brooks?" Emily inhaled slowly. "I altered the manifest because I believe the seat assignment was incorrect," she admitted. "I did not confirm before acting." Naomi watched her carefully. Not searching for emotion. Searching for accountability. Believed based on what? Naomi asked. Quietly. The same question she had asked at 37,000 feet. Emily did not hesitate this time. "Based on how she appeared," she answered. The word appeared lingered in the room longer than it should have. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. "And what does leadership appear like?" she asked. No one answered immediately. Rachel broke the silence. "Leadership appears consistent with policy," she said. Naomi nodded. "Exactly." She turned her gaze back to Daniel and Emily. "You both represent Skybridge Airlines to every passenger who steps onto an aircraft. When you assume, the brand assumes. When you alter access, the system alters trust." Daniel met her eyes directly. "I understand that now," he said. Naomi studied him for a moment. Understanding is the beginning, she replied. Reform is the continuation. Angela tapped her tablet once. Per policy, she said evenly. Temporary suspension is effective immediately pending board review. Further employment status will be determined after full investigation. Emily lowered her gaze. Daniel nodded once more. No one argued. No one raised their voice. Accountability did not require spectacle. It required acceptance. The meeting ended without drama. Daniel and Emily were escorted respectfully to complete documentation. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded more final than loud. Rachel remained on screen. The board is requesting a live session in 3 hours, she said. Media inquiries are increasing. Naomi stood from her chair and walked toward the glass wall, looking out at the runway beyond the terminal. Planes lifted into the orange glow of early evening. There will be no press conference, she said calmly. Issue a statement emphasizing policy revision and internal review. No names. No humiliation. Rachel nodded. Understood. And begin drafting the live audit transparency initiative, Naomi added. I want mandatory dual verification on premium cabin reassignment. No single crew member may alter a manifest without secondary clearance. Angela looked up. Effective immediately? She asked. Naomi did not hesitate. Effective immediately. By the time Naomi exited the conference room, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the polished terminal floor. Passengers moved through the space, unaware of the structural shift that had just occurred. Maya Collins stood near the far end of the corridor, still in uniform, waiting. Naomi approached her without ceremony. Why are you still here? Naomi asked gently. Maya straightened. I requested to observe the review process. She replied. Naomi raised one eyebrow slightly. And what did you observe? Maya thought carefully before answering. That authority can be corrected without anger, she said. Naomi smiled faintly. Remember that. They walked side by side toward the exit doors. Outside, the Los Angeles evening air carried the distant hum of traffic and aircraft engines. A black sedan waited at the curb, driver standing by. Naomi paused before stepping in. Maya, she said, turning toward the young trainee. What did today change for you? Maya considered the question with more seriousness than her years suggested. It changed how I see silence, she answered. Silence can protect bias. Or it can protect dignity. It depends on who holds it. Naomi nodded slowly. Choose carefully which one you hold, she said. The car door closed softly behind her as the sedan pulled away from the terminal. Inside, Naomi leaned back against the leather seat, watching the airport lights blur past the window. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from the mother who had been seated across the aisle. A simple text forwarded through corporate contact. My daughter has already started her scholarship essay. She wrote about today. Naomi allowed herself the smallest exhale of satisfaction. Not pride. Not triumph. Alignment. At headquarters the next morning, the boardroom filled with executives in tailored suits and cautious expressions. The large digital screen displayed the internal audit report from Flight 227. Naomi stood at the front, not elevated on a stage, but grounded beside the table. We do not exist to defend image, she began evenly. We exist to deliver fairness at 30,000 feet and at the gate. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. She continued. Bias rarely announces itself. It hides behind protocol. That is why protocol must be transparent. She outlined the new policy revisions, the dual verification mandate, the quarterly bias training audits. No one interrupted. By the end of the meeting, unanimous approval was recorded. The reform would not be temporary. It would be structural. Later that afternoon, a company-wide memo reached every Skybridge employee. It did not mention names. It did not recount embarrassment. It stated only this. Respect is not determined by appearance. It is verified by policy. Non-compliance will be corrected immediately. In the weeks that followed, the Live Audit Transparency Initiative reshaped internal procedures across 57 aircraft and 12 regional hubs. Dual confirmation became standard. Crew training incorporated scenario simulations addressing perception bias. Maya Collins volunteered for the first leadership workshop cohort. Daniel Reeves submitted a written statement accepting responsibility and requesting retraining. Emily Brooks requested reassignment pending evaluation. Accountability did not end careers automatically. It redirected them through correction. 3 months later, Naomi boarded another Skybridge flight. Hoodie again. No announcement. The boarding pass scanned green. No one questioned her seat. The cabin crew greeted every passenger with the same steady tone. No glances lingered longer than necessary. No manifest shifted without dual verification. Naomi settled into her seat quietly and looked out the window as the aircraft prepared for departure. The engines roared softly, building power beneath her feet. Systems aligned. Procedures confirmed. No one mistook composure for weakness this time. As the plane lifted into open sky, one truth remained clear above the clouds. When leadership chooses correction over silence, altitude becomes more than distance traveled. It becomes progress earned. 6 months after Flight 227 reshaped the internal architecture of Skybridge Airlines, the effects were no longer theoretical. They were measurable. Compliance reports showed a 42% increase in proactive verification checks. Customer satisfaction scores in premium cabins rose by 11 points. Anonymous complaint filings decreased, but voluntary feedback submissions increased. People were speaking sooner. That was the real metric Naomi Carter watched. Not headlines. Not stock price fluctuations. Behavior. She stood in the executive observation suite overlooking Hangar 3 at the Chicago Operations Hub, hands loosely folded behind her back. A newly repainted aircraft rolled slowly across the tarmac below, sunlight reflecting off its polished fuselage. The Skybridge logo had not changed. The structure behind it had. Rachel Donovan stepped beside her, holding a tablet filled with updated training metrics. The first wave of dual verification audits is complete, Rachel said evenly. No manifest alterations without secondary clearance in the last 90 days. Naomi nodded once. An internal response time? She asked. Average of 3 minutes and 40 seconds from flag to supervisor acknowledgement, Rachel replied. Naomi allowed herself a small exhale. Systems were only as strong as their response speed. In the months since the incident, Naomi had traveled frequently without announcing her presence. Detroit, Phoenix, Dallas. She wore the same understated hoodie, the same neutral sneakers. Not to provoke, not to trap, to observe. The difference was subtle but consistent. Crew members verified politely. They did not linger suspiciously. They did not assume. Respect had become procedural rather than performative. That was the point. In Los Angeles, Maya Collins completed her first leadership workshop module. She now wore a small silver pin beneath her name tag that read Cabin Lead in Training. She had requested placement on cross-functional committees reviewing passenger interaction guidelines. Her supervisor noted in her evaluation that she demonstrated decisive communication under pressure. Maya did not consider herself brave. She considered herself awake. Daniel Reeves had entered retraining voluntarily. Instead of contesting his suspension, he attended bias recognition seminars and completed advanced compliance coursework. The board allowed conditional reinstatement under probationary review. He did not return to command immediately. He returned as co-pilot. Authority rebuilt slowly, through humility rather than rank. Emily Brooks had taken a different route. She requested transfer out of premium cabin service and entered a customer advocacy training program. The company assigned her a compliance mentor. Her progress reports showed measurable improvement in procedural adherence and communication tone. Naomi had reviewed those reports personally, not to monitor punishment, but to assess reform. Accountability without redemption breeds fear. Accountability with structure builds change. One afternoon in early spring, Naomi boarded a regional flight from Denver to Chicago. Seat 2A again. The boarding pass scanned green. The gate agent smiled without hesitation. Welcome aboard, she said evenly. No second glance. No whispered conversation. Inside the cabin, a young flight attendant approached with a tablet in hand. Ms. Carter, he said politely after scanning his device. Please confirm this is your assigned seat. Naomi handed him the boarding pass without comment. He scanned it again, confirmed, and nodded. Thank you for your patience, he said. The interaction lasted less than 15 seconds. It felt ordinary. That was the success. Mid-flight, a turbulence advisory required crew to secure service early. The captain's voice remained steady over the intercom. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft adjusted altitude. Naomi watched as the crew moved methodically, no panic, no raised voices. Systems working under pressure. She closed her eyes briefly, remembering the first time she had walked into a boardroom at 28 years old with majority stake documents in her briefcase. The room had fallen quiet then too. Silence can be disbelief or recalibration. The difference lies in what follows. At headquarters, the live audit transparency initiative evolved into a full cultural alignment program. Quarterly simulation exercises recreated complex passenger scenarios. Employees were trained to separate perception from protocol. Supervisors were evaluated not only on punctual departures, but on fairness compliance scores. Shareholders noticed. Stock analysts commented on operational consistency rather than controversy. Naomi attended the annual leadership summit that summer without keynote theatrics. She stood before a room of 300 managers and spoke in a measured tone. The goal is not to eliminate error, she said evenly. The goal is to eliminate unchecked assumption. No applause interrupted her. None was needed. The message traveled further than volume ever could. During a break in the summit, Maya approached her, now fully certified as cabin lead. We implemented the dual verification drill last week, she said. 2 trainees questioned a seating irregularity before it escalated. Naomi nodded. And how did it resolve, she asked. With clarity, Maya replied. No embarrassment. Just confirmation. Naomi smiled faintly. That is how reform sounds, she said. Later that year, Daniel Reeves stood at the front of a retraining seminar addressing new pilots. He did not hide his experience. Authority does not exempt you from review, he told them plainly. It demands it. His tone carried weight because it carried consequence. In a separate training room, Emily facilitated a discussion group on perception bias. She did not present herself as a victim of circumstance. She presented herself as proof that correction was possible. The ripple effect extended beyond aircraft cabins. Ground staff revised boarding announcements to emphasize inclusion language. Internal hiring metrics reflected broader candidate review panels. Policy became culture. Culture became expectation. One evening, Naomi received a letter forwarded through corporate mail. It was handwritten. The aerospace engineering student from Flight 227 had been accepted into her first-choice university. She wrote that she planned to specialize in aircraft systems design with a focus on safety and access equity. Naomi folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer in her office. Reform had altitude beyond policy. It carried forward into aspiration. Months later, during an unannounced audit flight to Seattle, Naomi noticed a small detail. A passenger seated in premium cabin appeared uncertain when scanning his boarding pass. The crew member assisting him did not question his presence. She verified, smiled, and moved on. Naomi watched without intervening. The process required no correction. That was the measure. When the aircraft landed smoothly in Seattle rain, Naomi remained seated as others disembarked. She looked around the cabin one last time. No tension, no undercurrent, just routine professionalism. She rose quietly and stepped into the aisle. At the terminal exit, a junior operations manager approached her cautiously. Ms. Carter, he said, the board has nominated you for industry leadership recognition this year. Naomi paused. For what? She asked. For advancing compliance culture across the sector, he replied. Naomi considered that. If recognition arrives, she said calmly, let it highlight the team, not the incident. The manager nodded, understanding. Outside, the Seattle sky hung gray and expansive. Naomi walked toward the waiting car without ceremony. She did not replay the moment months earlier when authority had faltered in midair. She replayed the quiet confirmations since. Dual checks, calm interactions, training rooms filled, systems adjusted. The work was not finished. It would never be finished. Culture requires maintenance like aircraft engines require inspection. But now, when passengers boarded Skybridge flights, they stepped into cabins shaped by more than upholstery and service class. They stepped into a structure that had learned. And as another aircraft lifted into the overcast sky behind her, Naomi understood something steady and simple. Power is not proven in confrontation alone. It is proven in what changes afterward. 1 year after the cabin lights flickered on Flight 227 and a single seat assignment exposed a deeper fault line, Skybridge Airlines no longer felt like a company recovering from an incident. It felt like a company that had recalibrated its compass. Naomi Carter stood at the edge of runway 4 in Chicago on a brisk autumn morning. coat collar turned slightly against the wind, watching a newly delivered aircraft taxi toward its hangar. The plane carried a small inscription beneath the cockpit window that had not existed before. In clean silver lettering it read, "Verified respect." Most passengers would never notice it. That was intentional. Reform did not require banners. It required embedding. Rachel Donovan approached with a folder tucked under her arm. The Department of Transportation has requested a case study on the Live Audit Transparency Initiative, she said evenly. Naomi did not take her eyes off the aircraft. Will they publish it? She asked. Yes, Rachel replied. Naomi nodded once. Then include the data, not the drama. The wind carried the distant hum of jet engines and ground equipment. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, recalling how different that sound had felt a year earlier. Back then, noise had carried tension. Now it carried momentum. Inside headquarters, a wall-sized display tracked compliance metrics in real time across all 57 active aircraft. Dual verification flags, supervisor response times, passenger feedback sentiment. The numbers moved steadily, not erratically. Consistency was the quietest victory. In Los Angeles, Maya Collins now led her own cabin crew rotation. She wore the cabin lead insignia with composure rather than pride. During a boarding sequence, she noticed a passenger hesitate while scanning his boarding pass. Instead of assuming confusion or error, she smiled and said, "Let us verify together." The scanner flashed green. She nodded once and stepped aside. The exchange lasted 5 seconds. It carried no tension. That was the difference. In Denver, Daniel Reeves completed his probationary period and returned to captain status after unanimous board approval. During his first command flight post-reinstatement, he addressed the crew before takeoff. Authority is not immunity, he said calmly. It is responsibility. No one in the cockpit questioned what he meant. In Phoenix, Emily Brooks completed her customer advocacy certification and accepted a permanent role within the Passenger Experience Review Office. She no longer wore a cabin uniform. She wore business attire and facilitated quarterly listening sessions with frontline staff. During one session, a junior attendant admitted she had once felt uncertain about questioning a supervisor's decision. Emily responded without hesitation. "Uncertainty is a signal," she said. "Follow it until it becomes clarity. Growth does not erase history. It reshapes it." Naomi traveled frequently that year, not for visibility, but for verification. She boarded at small regional gates and large international terminals alike. She watched for hesitation, for assumption, for silence. What she observed instead was rhythm. Crew members verified politely and moved on. Supervisors stepped in when flagged without defensiveness. Policy had become reflex. One evening in New York, Naomi attended a closed-door industry roundtable with executives from competing airlines. The conversation shifted toward operational risk management. One executive leaned forward and asked directly, "How did you manage the internal fallout?" Naomi answered evenly, "We did not manage fallout. We addressed foundation." The room grew quiet. Another executive asked, "Did you fear reputational damage?" Naomi's expression did not change. "Reputation is not damaged by correction," she replied. "It is damaged by denial." Outside the conference room, the skyline glowed against the darkening sky. Inside, a different kind of alignment took shape. Weeks later, the aerospace engineering student who had written Naomi months earlier stood at the edge of a university lab, holding a small-scale wing prototype. She sent a photograph to Skybridge headquarters with a note that read, "Designing for Access." Naomi placed the photo beside the handwritten letter in her office drawer. Reform had ripple effects she could not measure with compliance charts. In Chicago, the annual shareholder meeting filled the auditorium with investors and analysts. Naomi stepped to the podium without dramatic introduction. 12 months ago, she began calmly. We activated a protocol mid-flight. Not because we sought attention, but because we required correction. She did not recount the incident. She outlined the outcomes. Increased verification accuracy. Reduced complaint escalation time. Elevated training retention scores. The data spoke without spectacle. After the presentation, an investor approached her privately. "You grounded a flight to fix a flaw," he said. Naomi met his gaze. "We grounded assumption," she replied. The flight continued. Later that afternoon, Naomi walked alone through Hangar 3 again. Maintenance crews worked methodically beneath suspended aircraft, inspecting engines, recalibrating instruments. She paused beside a mechanic tightening a panel bolt. "What happens if that bolt is slightly loose?" she asked. The mechanic glanced up. "It fails under pressure," he replied. Naomi nodded once. Culture functioned the same way. Under pressure, loose assumptions revealed themselves. Properly tightened, they held steady at altitude. As winter approached, Skybridge implemented its first external audit under federal review. Inspectors combed through training modules and compliance logs. Their final report concluded that Skybridge had set a new benchmark for passenger verification transparency. Naomi read the report alone in her office late one evening. She did not frame it. She filed it. Recognition was a checkpoint, not a destination. On a quiet December morning, Naomi boarded a flight to Atlanta. Seat 2A again. The boarding pass scanned green. A young attendant greeted her warmly. "Welcome back," he said. No hesitation. No scrutiny. Just procedure. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Naomi looked around the cabin. A businessman reviewed documents. A family settled children into seats. A college student adjusted headphones. No one wondered who belonged where. The engines roared gently as the aircraft lifted into a pale winter sky. Naomi watched the ground. Recede beneath them. She did not think about confrontation. She thought about calibration. 1 year earlier, silence had been mistaken for weakness. Now silence meant stability. After landing in Atlanta, Naomi walked through the terminal unnoticed. That was always her preference. Power did not require recognition. It required readiness. Her phone vibrated with a message from Rachel. The Department of Transportation case study has been approved for publication. Industry adoption inquiries increasing. Naomi typed a short response. Share framework openly. Improvement is not proprietary. She stepped outside into the crisp air. Aircraft ascended in steady intervals behind her, their paths clean against the blue sky. The world did not pause for reform. It moved with it. Naomi paused near the curb, looking back at the terminal entrance. 1 year earlier, assumption had tried to narrow a seat assignment into something smaller than policy. Instead, policy had expanded to protect dignity. She allowed herself one quiet reflection before stepping into the waiting car. Correction does not announce itself loudly. It integrates. It repeats. It becomes routine. And when routine aligns with respect, altitude is no longer just a measure of miles traveled. It becomes a measure of progress sustained. 2 years after a single seat assignment exposed a fracture in Skybridge Airlines, the company no longer referred to that day as an incident. Internally, they called it the inflection point. Naomi Carter stood alone in the executive briefing room before sunrise, city lights still flickering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of headquarters. A fresh quarterly report glowed across the wall display behind her. Compliance accuracy, 99.3%. Passenger trust index, highest in company history. Voluntary internal reporting, up 30%. She did not smile. She absorbed. Metrics were not trophies. They were temperature readings. Outside, a thin layer of frost coated the runway lights at O'Hare, each one steady and aligned in perfect sequence. Systems mattered. Alignment mattered more. Rachel Donovan entered quietly with a slim tablet tucked beneath her arm. Federal Aviation Council has adopted elements of our transparency model, she said evenly. Naomi nodded once. Implementation timeline? She asked. Phased over 12 months nationwide, Rachel replied. Naomi folded her hands behind her back. Reform had moved beyond corporate boundaries. It was now structural in the broader industry. Later that morning, she boarded a Skybridge flight to Washington, D.C., unannounced as always. Seat 2A. Again. Hoodie, neutral sneakers, minimal presence. The boarding pass scanned green without pause. A flight attendant greeted her warmly, but without recognition. Welcome aboard, he said, eyes steady, tone consistent. He did not linger. He did not scrutinize. He followed process. That was the point. Naomi settled into her seat and observed the rhythm of the cabin. Dual verification tablets rested openly in attendants' hands. Supervisors rotated through boarding zones offering support without dominance. No tension clung to the air. No subtle hesitation preceded confirmation. A young business traveler paused briefly near first class, uncertain about overhead bin space. The attendant assisted him without assumption. Verified. Confirmed. Moved on. Ordinary. Powerful. As the aircraft ascended through scattered clouds at 20,000 feet, Naomi allowed her thoughts to drift backward, not to relive confrontation, but to measure distance. 2 years earlier, silence had been interpreted as weakness. Now silence meant efficiency. The captain's voice came calmly over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are cruising at 37,000 feet. The phrase carried no hidden weight, only altitude. Mid-flight, a turbulence advisory required brief seat belt enforcement. Crew members moved swiftly, calm in their direction, clear in their communication. Naomi watched how authority manifested now, not as volume, not as assumption, as structure. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man leaned slightly toward her. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I work in regulatory policy. Your airline has become a case study." Naomi turned her head slightly. "For what?" she asked. "For demonstrating that transparency improves efficiency," he replied. "It seems counterintuitive." Naomi considered that. "Clarity removes friction," she said simply. The man nodded thoughtfully and returned to his notes. After landing in Washington, Naomi was met by a small delegation from the Federal Aviation Council. No press, no cameras, just policy analysts and compliance officers carrying folders thick with documentation. In a conference room overlooking the Potomac River, she stood before a digital presentation outlining Skybridge's evolution. She did not mention names. She did not recount emotion. She outlined process shifts, dual confirmation mandates, immediate supervisor override tracking, quarterly bias recalibration sessions. "Assumption is not an isolated flaw," she said evenly. "It is a systemic vulnerability. Correct the vulnerability, and the system stabilizes." The room remained attentive. Questions followed. Implementation costs, training timelines, legal considerations. Naomi answered each one without dramatics. Reform was not personal. It was procedural. Weeks later, the Federal Aviation Council released an industry advisory recommending adoption of live audit protocols modeled after Skybridge. Competing airlines began requesting consultation sessions. Naomi agreed to host them, not for dominance, for durability. Back in Chicago, Maya Collins now directed cabin leadership training across 3 regional hubs. She opened her sessions with a single statement. Respect is verified, not assumed. Trainees listened because she spoke from experience. Daniel Reeves, now fully reinstated, mentored new captains in oversight ethics. He shared his probationary journey candidly. "Authority is strongest when it welcomes review," he told them. Emily Brooks, working within passenger experience review, facilitated industry webinars on perception bias recognition. She did not position herself as redeemed. She positioned herself as accountable. Correction had given her credibility. One autumn afternoon, Naomi received an invitation from a national aviation museum. They wanted to include the Live Audit Transparency Initiative as part of a permanent exhibit on modern aviation safety culture. She considered it briefly before responding. "If included," she wrote, "focus on systemic change, not individual narrative." The museum agreed. In the exhibit hall months later, visitors read about verification systems and procedural equity beside displays of historic aircraft models. Reform sat quietly between innovation and tradition. One evening, Naomi walked alone along the observation deck overlooking a runway at sunset. Planes lifted one by one into streaks of orange sky. Each departure relied on checklists completed without exception. She thought about checklists beyond aviation. Assumptions unchecked become turbulence. Procedures aligned become lift. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Rachel appeared. International regulators in Europe requesting consultation. Naomi typed a brief response. Schedule virtual session. Share framework openly. Progress multiplies when shared. She slid the phone back into her coat pocket and continued walking. The wind carried the scent of jet fuel and cold air. The runway lights blinked steadily in perfect sequence. No one on the departing flights knew the origin of the protocols guiding their boarding process. They did not need to. Safety and respect function best when invisible but consistent. Weeks later, Naomi boarded an early morning flight to Seattle. Seat 2A again. Boarding pass scanned green. A new trainee greeted her. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. Please allow me to verify your assignment." The scanner confirmed. The trainee smiled and stepped aside. No tension. No hesitation. Naomi nodded once in acknowledgement. As the plane climbed through a blanket of gray clouds, she looked around the cabin. A child laughed softly near the window. A businesswoman typed steadily on her laptop. A retired couple shared a quiet conversation. None of them questioned whether they belonged in their assigned seats. That quiet certainty was the legacy. After landing, Naomi remained seated until most passengers exited. She watched the aisle clear gradually. Routine had replaced friction. Structure had replaced assumption. She rose finally, adjusting her hoodie lightly, and stepped into the terminal without announcement. Outside, the Pacific Northwest sky stretched wide and pale. Aircraft engines hummed in distant cadence. 2 years earlier, a single verification had revealed a crack in the system. Now, thousands of verifications occurred daily without disruption. Reform had not been loud. It had been layered. It had integrated into checklists, training manuals, leadership briefings, and passenger interactions. As Naomi walked toward the waiting car, she paused briefly to watch another plane ascend into open sky. Altitude no longer represented escape from a moment. It represented evolution beyond it. And in that steady upward trajectory, one truth remained clear. When correction becomes culture, progress does not announce itself. It simply continues to rise. 3 years after a quiet recalibration at 37,000 feet redirected the culture of Skybridge Airlines, the company found itself facing something different. Not accusation. Not oversight. Expansion. Naomi Carter stood in the newly constructed International Operations Wing at headquarters, sunlight spilling across the polished floor as a delegation from 5 global carriers reviewed Skybridge's transparency architecture. The Live Audit Transparency Initiative, once a corrective measure, had become a blueprint requested across continents. On the large digital wall behind her, global implementation markers glowed in steady blue across North America, parts of Europe, and emerging hubs in Asia. Naomi did not present with theatrical emphasis. She stood with her hands loosely clasped, voice even, cadence deliberate. Verification is not about distrust, she said calmly. It is about removing assumption before it compounds. The room listened without interruption. Representatives from London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo took notes, not on the origin story, but on the system integration model. That was intentional. Naomi had insisted the framework be shared without dramatization. Reform thrives when it is transferable. Later that afternoon, Naomi boarded a transatlantic flight to London for a regulatory summit. Seat 2A again. Boarding pass scanned green. A flight attendant verified the assignment with steady professionalism. No hesitation. No pause. Just confirmation. Naomi settled into her seat and looked around the cabin. 3 years earlier, silence had been heavy with uncertainty. Now silence felt efficient, unburdened. As the aircraft climbed above the clouds, the captain announced cruising altitude at 39,000 feet. Naomi opened her tablet and reviewed the latest industry compliance report. Adoption rates of dual verification protocols had surpassed 60% among major carriers. Anonymous bias complaint rates industry-wide had declined by measurable margins. Systems were adjusting beyond Skybridge. Across the aisle, a woman in her early 20s recognized Naomi from a leadership conference. She leaned slightly closer. "Excuse me," she said softly. "You are Naomi Carter, correct?" Naomi nodded once. "Yes." The woman smiled. "I work in aviation safety analytics. Your transparency model is being taught in our graduate program." Naomi regarded her calmly. "Then improve it," she said. The woman blinked, surprised. "Improve it?" she repeated. Naomi's voice remained steady. "Progress becomes fragile when it stops evolving." The woman nodded slowly, absorbing the challenge. Hours later, as the aircraft crossed over the Atlantic, Naomi glanced out the window at the vast darkness below. She remembered that first flight years ago when verification had been withheld and authority misdirected. The contrast now was not dramatic. It was procedural. Crew members moved confidently, confirming assignments without personal judgment. Supervisors rotated discreetly, offering oversight without intrusion. Culture had settled into routine. After landing at Heathrow, Naomi was escorted not by security, but by policy advisors eager to understand how implementation scaled without backlash. In a glass conference room overlooking the runway, she outlined the phased adoption plan. Begin with internal education. she said evenly. Transparency requires understanding before enforcement. One advisor asked directly, "Was there resistance within your organization?" Naomi considered the question carefully. "There was discomfort," she answered. "Discomfort is not resistance. It is awareness expanding." Back in Chicago weeks later, the annual employee summit filled the auditorium with crew members from across the country. Naomi stood at the center of the stage, not elevated by spotlight, but grounded by presence. Behind her, the screen displayed a single word: alignment. She did not recount past errors. She spoke of continuity. 3 years ago, we activated oversight to correct a vulnerability, she said calmly. Today, oversight is culture. Applause did not erupt immediately. Instead, heads nodded slowly in agreement. In Los Angeles, Maya Collins now oversaw regional cabin leadership development for the West Coast Division. She mentored new supervisors, emphasizing early intervention rather than reactive correction. During one workshop, a trainee asked her how to respond when uncertain about a passenger's documentation. Maya answered without hesitation. "Verify with respect," she said. "The process protects everyone." Daniel Reeves, now a senior captain mentoring younger pilots, shared his experience candidly during leadership retreats. He did not avoid the topic of assumption. He reframed it. "Confidence is not certainty," he told them. "Confidence is clarity earned through verification." Emily Brooks, fully established within passenger experience strategy, contributed to an industry white paper on perception bias mitigation. She no longer flinched when referencing her early missteps. She used them as instructional anchors. Correction had become credibility. One winter evening, Naomi received an invitation to testify before a congressional aviation subcommittee reviewing national passenger protection standards. She accepted without fanfare. In the hearing room months later, she sat before a panel of lawmakers beneath bright lights and steady cameras. Questions came measured and precise. "What triggered your policy overhaul?" one senator asked. Naomi answered evenly. "A procedural vulnerability revealed itself. We corrected it." Another asked, "Did the incident harm your brand?" Naomi's expression did not shift. "Correction strengthened it," she replied. Headlines the following morning did not focus on controversy. They focused on policy replication. Skybridge had become a reference point rather than an exception. On a quiet spring afternoon, Naomi boarded a routine flight from Chicago to Atlanta. Seat 2A again. The boarding pass scanned green. A young attendant verified, smiled, and stepped aside. Naomi looked down the aisle as passengers settled in. A diverse array of travelers occupied first class without tension. No one wondered who belonged. No one glanced twice at simplicity in attire. The engines hummed steadily as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. As the plane accelerated, lifting cleanly into open sky, Naomi reflected not on altitude gained, but on friction removed. 3 years earlier, assumption had attempted to compress identity into perception. Now verification expanded dignity into process. After landing, she walked through the terminal unnoticed, blending into the steady flow of travelers. That anonymity was deliberate. Power does not require recognition when systems operate correctly. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. A new Skybridge aircraft lifted into the sky behind her, climbing smoothly against a pale horizon. Its ascent was unremarkable, routine, stable, and in that stability lay the quiet evidence of reform sustained. Naomi paused briefly before stepping into her waiting car, allowing herself one final reflection. Progress is not loud. It does not echo through cabins or courtrooms. It settles into checklists, into training manuals, into the steady tone of a crew member verifying a seat without hesitation. 3 years earlier, a single verification failure had exposed a fracture. Now, thousands of verifications occurred daily without disruption. That was the transformation. Not spectacle. Not retaliation. Alignment. And as another aircraft traced its path into the evening sky, one truth remained steady beneath the hum of engines and the glow of runway lights. When leadership chooses correction over comfort, altitude becomes not just distance traveled, but trust maintained. 5 years after a single verification failure reshaped the architecture of Skybridge Airlines, the company no longer measured its success in quarterly revenue alone. It measured it in friction removed. Naomi Carter stood in the newly expanded Global Oversight Center at headquarters in Chicago, a circular room lined with real-time dashboards tracking flights across 6 continents. The displays did not flash with alarms. They glowed steadily in coordinated patterns of green and blue. Compliance response time averaged under 2 minutes worldwide. Dual verification adherence remained above 99%. Passenger trust metrics continued to rise. Naomi did not stand at the center of the room for ceremony. She stood there because oversight never stops. Rachel Donovan entered quietly, tablet in hand. The International Aviation Alliance has finalized adoption of the transparency framework, she said evenly. 72 carriers now operate under some version of it. Naomi nodded once. Standardization? She asked. In progress, Rachel replied. Naomi folded her hands lightly behind her back and looked up at the world map. 5 years earlier, one aircraft at one gate had revealed a blind spot. Now, thousands of aircraft verified passengers daily without assumption. That was not coincidence. That was culture recalibrated. Later that week, Naomi boarded a Skybridge flight from Chicago to San Francisco. Seat 2A again. Hoodie. Neutral sneakers. No announcement. The boarding pass scanned green with a soft beep. The gate agent smiled professionally and waved her through. Inside the cabin, a young attendant greeted her without hesitation. Welcome aboard, he said, tone even, posture open. He scanned her boarding pass once more as procedure required and nodded. You are confirmed in 2A. No pause. No double take. Naomi settled into her seat and glanced around. First class filled steadily with a cross-section of travelers. A technology executive in a tailored suit. A nurse in scrubs. A college student wearing headphones and a worn backpack. No one measured belonging by attire. Verification had replaced perception. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude at 38,000 feet, Naomi opened her tablet and reviewed the annual Global Oversight Report. Adoption rates of transparency policies across partner airlines had reached 80%. Incident escalation times had decreased industry-wide. She scrolled through testimonials from crew members in Tokyo, Frankfurt, and Sao Paulo describing how the system removed uncertainty from difficult moments. Structure had replaced hesitation. Across the aisle, a senior operations analyst recognized her from congressional hearings years earlier. Ms. Carter, he said quietly, your policy shifted the industry. Naomi looked at him calmly. Policy did not shift it, she replied. Consistency did. The analyst nodded thoughtfully and returned to his notes. Mid-flight, light turbulence prompted a seat belt advisory. Crew members moved efficiently, verifying compliance without tension. Naomi observed the cadence. Authority felt calm, not defensive. The difference was subtle. It was also permanent. After landing in San Francisco, Naomi walked through the terminal unnoticed, blending into the steady current of passengers. Outside, a new Skybridge aircraft bearing the verified respect inscription lifted into a pale Pacific sky. The inscription remained understated. Reform was not branding. It was embedded. Weeks later, Naomi addressed the annual Global Aviation Leadership Forum in Geneva. The auditorium held executives, regulators, and policy scholars from around the world. She stood at the podium without theatrical introduction. Behind her, the screen displayed a single phrase: verification is dignity. She did not recount the event that triggered the initiative years earlier. She spoke about system vulnerability and structural correction. Assumption is a quiet risk, she said evenly. It thrives in unchecked authority. Remove the vulnerability, and the system stabilizes. The audience listened without interruption. Questions followed. How do you maintain vigilance after success? How do you prevent complacency? Naomi answered each one with steady clarity. Culture must be inspected like engines, she said. Regularly. Without ego. Back in Chicago, Maya Collins now directed global cabin leadership development across multiple international hubs. She facilitated cross-cultural training sessions, emphasizing that verification is universal. During one seminar in Madrid, a trainee asked how to respond when a passenger appears out of place in premium seating. Maya smiled gently. No one appears out of place when the manifest confirms them, she said. Daniel Reeves, now serving as senior flight standards advisor, mentored captains across partner airlines adopting the transparency model. He shared his experience without defensiveness. Authority without oversight is incomplete, he told them. Emily Brooks, leading passenger experience analytics, published an industry paper on procedural bias mitigation. She no longer introduced herself through apology. She introduced herself through data. Correction had become qualification. One quiet autumn afternoon, Naomi visited the aerospace engineering program, where the former student from Flight 227 now taught a graduate seminar on equitable aircraft systems design. They walked along a campus pathway lined with turning leaves. "You changed more than policy," the professor said softly. Naomi shook her head slightly. "Systems change systems," she replied. "People carry them forward." Back at headquarters that evening, Naomi stood once more in the Global Oversight Center. The world map glowed steadily. A flight from Johannesburg verified manifest integrity in under 90 seconds. A regional carrier in Canada reported 0 unresolved seating discrepancies for the quarter. The metrics were not dramatic. They were consistent. Her phone vibrated lightly. A message from Rachel appeared. 5-year review complete. Board unanimously renewing oversight charter with expanded authority. Naomi typed a brief response. Continue audits quarterly. Expand training partnerships. Progress sustains through repetition. She slipped the phone into her pocket and looked up at the map again. 5 years earlier, silence had been mistaken for submission. Now silence meant systems operating without friction. No raised voices. No reactive corrections. Just alignment. The next morning, Naomi boarded another routine flight. Seat 2A again. Boarding pass scanned green. The attendant verified, smiled, and stepped aside. Ordinary. That was the triumph. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into open sky, Naomi reflected not on confrontation, but on continuation. Reform had moved beyond one company, beyond one continent. It had become expectation. After landing, she remained seated until the aisle cleared, watching passengers depart without hesitation. She rose quietly, adjusted her hoodie, and stepped into the terminal flow without announcement. Outside, the sun cast long beams across the tarmac. Aircraft ascended one after another, their paths clean and uninterrupted. In the steady hum of engines and the quiet rhythm of verification, one truth endured. When leadership chooses correction over comfort, culture recalibrates. And when culture recalibrates, altitude is no longer just a measure of distance traveled. It becomes a measure of trust sustained across time. 7 years after a single verification failure quietly redirected the trajectory of Skybridge Airlines, the word reform was no longer used internally. It had been replaced by a different word. Standard. Naomi Carter stood in the Global Oversight Center as dawn broke over Chicago, pale lights stretching across the curved wall of digital displays that mapped flights across the world. Hundreds of aircraft icons moved in synchronized arcs over continents and oceans. None were flagged. None were paused for procedural discrepancy. Compliance response time averaged 1 minute and 58 seconds globally. Dual verification adherence remained above 99% for the 6th consecutive quarter. Naomi did not smile. Stability was not an emotional event. It was an engineered outcome. Rachel Donovan stepped beside her with the morning metrics report. The International Aviation Alliance has fully standardized the transparency protocol, she said evenly. It is no longer referred to as an adaptation. It is baseline. Naomi nodded once. Baseline means maintenance, she replied. Not complacency. She turned her gaze toward the live feed of a Skybridge aircraft departing from Johannesburg. The captain confirmed boarding closure. The manifest showed verified. The aircraft taxied without delay. Ordinary. That was the measure of success. Later that week, Naomi boarded a Skybridge flight from Chicago to Atlanta. Seat 2A again. Hoodie. Neutral sneakers. No recognition requested. The boarding pass scanned green with a soft confirmation tone. The gate agent offered a professional smile. You are all set, she said calmly. No second look. No hesitation. Inside the cabin, a senior attendant approached with a tablet. Good afternoon, she said. Please allow me to verify your seat. The scan confirmed. The attendant nodded and moved on. The interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. Naomi settled into her seat and looked down the aisle. The rhythm of boarding carried no tension. Passengers entered first class wearing suits, sweatshirts, uniforms, casual jackets. No one measured worth by wardrobe. Verification had erased speculation. As the aircraft climbed through scattered clouds to 37,000 feet, Naomi reviewed a message from the Department of Transportation confirming that the transparency model had been integrated into national aviation compliance requirements. What began as correction had become regulation. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman reading an industry journal glanced at Naomi and then at the cover headline, Transparency in Aviation Safety. She leaned slightly closer. You changed more than one company, she said softly. Naomi turned her head calmly. Systems changed, she replied. People implemented. The woman nodded thoughtfully. It is rare to see correction become culture. Naomi looked back toward the window. Culture is just repetition aligned, she said quietly. Mid-flight, a minor routing adjustment required a brief announcement from the cockpit. The captain's voice remained steady. The cabin responded without concern. Crew members verified seat belts and tray tables methodically. Naomi watched the cadence. Authority felt grounded, not defensive. Years earlier, authority had mistaken assumption for efficiency. Now efficiency was built on confirmation. After landing in Atlanta, Naomi remained seated until most passengers exited. She observed how naturally the system flowed. No raised voices. No uncertainty. Just structure operating without friction. She rose quietly and stepped into the terminal. Outside, aircraft ascended in measured intervals beneath a pale southern sky. Each departure represented hundreds of confirmations executed without spectacle. Weeks later, Naomi addressed the annual International Aviation Symposium in Montreal. The auditorium held regulators, engineers, airline executives, and policy scholars. She stood at the podium without dramatic introduction. Behind her, the screen displayed 3 words, verify, correct, repeat. She did not recount the moment years earlier that triggered change. She spoke about systemic vulnerability. Assumption is efficient until it fails, she said evenly. Verification is slower by seconds, but faster in consequence. The room remained silent as she outlined the measurable impact across the industry. Reduced passenger escalation rates. Increased crew confidence scores. Enhanced regulatory alignment. No applause interrupted her sentences. The data spoke clearly. Back in Chicago, Maya Collins now directed global cabin standards for all Skybridge partner airlines. She opened a virtual training session with crew members from 5 continents. Verification is not suspicion, she said. It is respect made visible. Her voice carried authority shaped by experience. Daniel Reeves, now serving as senior aviation ethics advisor, traveled between international hubs conducting leadership workshops. He stood before young captains and said plainly, authority must welcome audit. His words carried weight because they were lived. Emily Brooks, leading passenger experience systems analytics, oversaw the quarterly publication of transparency benchmarks across the industry. She had transformed misjudgment into methodology. Correction had matured into contribution. One quiet evening, Naomi visited the Aviation Museum exhibit that now included a section on procedural transparency in modern flight operations. The display featured a small replica of a tablet screen showing dual verification confirmation. No names, no photographs of confrontation, just process. She stood there briefly, hands folded, observing families and students reading the placard. Reform had become instruction. Later that night, alone in her office, Naomi opened a folder containing the earliest internal memo announcing the live audit transparency initiative. The language was direct. No defensiveness. No blame. Just correction. She closed the folder gently and placed it back into the cabinet. History did not need to be displayed daily. It needed to be remembered privately. The next morning, she boarded another routine flight. Seat 2A again. The boarding pass scanned green. The attendant verified and smiled. Ordinary. The aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into open sky. Naomi looked around the cabin one more time. A young pilot trainee studied flight manuals 2 rows back. A grandmother showed a child how to fasten a seatbelt. A business consultant reviewed presentation slides. None of them questioned their right to occupy their assigned space. That quiet assurance was the outcome. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Naomi rested her hands lightly on the armrests. She did not replay confrontation. She replayed calibration. 7 years earlier, silence had been misread. Now silence signaled alignment. After landing, she stepped into the terminal unnoticed, blending into the steady current of travelers. Outside, a line of aircraft lifted into a clear morning sky, their ascent smooth and unremarkable. In the steady hum of engines and the consistent tone of verification, one truth endured beyond regulation, beyond recognition, beyond reputation. When leadership chooses correction without spectacle and accountability, without humiliation, culture does not fracture. It stabilizes. And when culture stabilizes, altitude becomes more than distance traveled. It becomes trust carried forward with every departure. 10 years after a quiet recalibration at a single departure gate reshaped the internal architecture of Skybridge Airlines, the company no longer measured progress in quarters or even in years. It measured it in habits. Naomi Carter stood alone in the Global Oversight Center just before sunrise, the city of Chicago still wrapped in pale blue morning light. The curved wall of digital displays stretched around her, tracking aircraft in motion across every major continent. Thousands of passengers were boarding at that very moment. Thousands of boarding passes were scanning green. Thousands of quiet verifications were happening without hesitation. Compliance adherence held steady above 99%. Escalation rates remained historically low. The system no longer reacted to crisis. It anticipated friction before it formed. Rachel Donovan stepped into the room, carrying the decade review report. 10-year assessment is complete, she said evenly. Independent auditors confirm industry-wide normalization of dual verification protocols. Transparency is now embedded across 89% of global commercial carriers. Naomi nodded once. And the remaining 11%? She asked. Adoption in progress, Rachel replied. Naomi folded her hands lightly behind her back. Progress is not a race, she said quietly. It is maintenance. Later that morning, Naomi boarded a routine Skybridge flight from Chicago to Los Angeles. Seat 2A again. Hoodie. Neutral sneakers. No entourage. The boarding pass scanned green. The gate agent smiled and stepped aside without scrutiny. Inside the cabin, a flight attendant approached with a tablet and a calm expression. Welcome aboard, she said evenly. Please allow me to confirm your assignment. The scanner beeped once. Confirmed. The attendant nodded and moved on. The interaction lasted seconds. It carried no weight. Naomi settled into her seat and observed the cabin fill. A tech founder in a tailored jacket. A public school teacher grading papers. A grandmother guiding a child into a window seat. No one questioned placement. No one hesitated. The system functioned without drama. As the aircraft climbed through scattered clouds toward 38,000 feet, Naomi looked out the window at the wide Midwestern sky. A decade earlier, silence in a cabin had felt heavy with misjudgment. Now silence felt structured. The captain's voice came calmly over the intercom announcing cruising altitude. Routine. Predictable. Steady. Across the aisle, a young aviation law student recognized Naomi from archived industry symposium footage. He leaned slightly closer. Ms. Carter, he said softly. Your oversight framework is cited in my textbook. Naomi turned her head gently. Then study its limitations, she replied. The student blinked, surprised. Limitations, he repeated. Naomi nodded once. Every system has them. Improvement requires acknowledging them. The student wrote something quickly in his notebook. Mid-flight, light turbulence required seat belt enforcement. Crew members moved through the aisle with calm authority, verifying compliance without raising their voices. Naomi watched the cadence of interaction. Authority had matured into presence rather than posture. Years ago, authority had relied on assumption. Now it relied on confirmation. After landing in Los Angeles, Naomi remained seated until the aisle cleared. She stood quietly and stepped into the steady flow of passengers without announcement. Outside the terminal, aircraft ascended in clean arcs against a warm California sky. Each departure carried invisible layers of verification embedded into routine. Weeks later, Naomi attended the Global Aviation Standards Summit in Singapore. The auditorium was filled with regulators, engineers, policy analysts, and airline executives. She stood before them without spectacle. Behind her, the screen displayed a simple phrase, structure sustains trust. She spoke evenly, her tone measured and deliberate. Correction is not an event, she said. It is a discipline. She outlined a decade of data. reduced complaint escalations, improved crew retention rates, cross-cultural training integration, international regulatory alignment. She did not mention names. She did not recount confrontation. The room listened as she described how transparency became infrastructure rather than initiative. Back in Chicago months later, Maya Collins now served as Global Vice President of Cabin Operations, overseeing leadership development across all Skybridge partner networks. She opened a quarterly training broadcast with a clear statement. Verification is not about doubt, she said. It is about dignity made procedural. Her voice carried clarity shaped by lived experience. Daniel Reeves, now approaching retirement, conducted his final leadership seminar for new captains. He stood before them with calm conviction. Authority must welcome audit, he said. If it does not, it weakens. His words resonated not because they were theoretical, but because they had been tested. Emily Brooks, leading international passenger experience analytics, presented a decade-long review of bias mitigation outcomes at a federal advisory hearing. She did not frame her contribution as redemption. She framed it as responsibility extended. Correction had matured into contribution. One quiet evening, Naomi walked through the Aviation Museum exhibit that now included a full interactive display on procedural transparency. Children tapped a screen demonstrating dual verification steps. A plaque explained how verification protocols enhance passenger trust. There were no dramatic headlines, only structure. Naomi stood quietly, observing a father explain the concept of confirmation to his daughter. Reform had moved beyond corporate memory into educational narrative. Later that night, back at headquarters, Naomi opened the Decade Review binder one final time. The first page contained the original internal memo, announcing immediate implementation of live audit transparency. The language was direct. No anger, no spectacle, just correction. She closed the binder gently and placed it in the archive cabinet. History did not need to be retold loudly. It needed to be honored quietly. The next morning, she boarded another flight. Seat 2A again. Boarding pass scanned green. The attendant verified, smiled, and stepped aside. Ordinary. The engines accelerated. The aircraft lifted into open sky. Naomi looked around the cabin once more. A young pilot trainee studied navigation charts. A medical resident reviewed patient notes. A small business owner rehearsed a presentation under her breath. None of them questioned their right to occupy their assigned space. That certainty was the outcome of discipline repeated over a decade. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Naomi rested her hands lightly on the armrests and closed her eyes briefly. 10 years earlier, assumption had attempted to narrow belonging. Now belonging was confirmed by process, not perception. After landing, she stepped into the terminal unnoticed, blending into the steady rhythm of travelers moving toward baggage claim and connecting gates. Outside, the sun cast a golden hue across the tarmac as aircraft ascended in seamless intervals. In the steady hum of engines and the quiet rhythm of verification, one truth endured beyond initiative, beyond recognition, beyond even memory. When leadership chooses correction, without humiliation and accountability, without spectacle, culture does not merely adjust. It stabilizes. And when culture stabilizes, altitude becomes more than miles traveled across the sky. It becomes trust carried forward with every departure, sustained not by a single moment of confrontation, but by a decade of disciplined alignment. 15 years after a single quiet correction altered the internal compass of an airline, Naomi Carter stood alone at Gate 27 in Chicago just before dawn, not as a chief executive officer preparing for another oversight review, but as a leader preparing to step back. The terminal lights reflected softly against the polished floor. Boarding had not yet begun. Outside the wide glass windows, a line of aircraft rested beneath a sky that was slowly shifting from indigo to pale gold. Thousands of flights had departed under the transparency framework she helped institutionalize. Millions of passengers had boarded without hesitation. Verification had become invisible, woven so tightly into procedure that few remembered it had once been optional. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her familiar black hoodie and looked down at the boarding pass in her hand. Seat 2A. The number had become less of a position and more of a reminder. Not of confrontation, of calibration. Rachel Donovan approached quietly, carrying no tablet this time. The board has finalized the succession plan, she said evenly. Naomi nodded once. It is time, she replied. There was no tension in her voice. Leadership had never been about permanence. It had been about alignment sustained long enough to endure beyond her presence. The Global Oversight Center now operated autonomously with rotating executive review committees. Maya Collins, now Chief Operations Officer, had already begun chairing international transparency summits. Daniel Reeves had retired with distinction, spending his final years mentoring pilots across emerging carriers. Emily Brooks directed an international advisory panel on passenger equity systems. The structure no longer required its origin story. It required continuity. Boarding began with the usual rhythm. The gate agent scanned Naomi's pass. Green. You are confirmed, the agent said politely. No second glance. No hesitation. Naomi stepped onto the jet bridge with steady composure. Inside the aircraft, a young flight attendant greeted her. Welcome aboard. Please allow me to verify your seat. The scan confirmed. You are in 2A, the attendant said with a professional nod. Ordinary. Naomi settled into her seat and placed her leather tote beneath the chair in front of her. Around her, passengers entered in quiet succession. A military officer in uniform. A software engineer in casual attire. A mother carrying a toddler. No one questioned placement. Verification had replaced perception so completely that the tension once associated with scrutiny no longer existed. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway, Naomi looked out at the runway lights stretching in precise alignment. Systems require maintenance. Culture requires vigilance. The captain's voice came calmly over the intercom announcing departure clearance. The engines accelerated. The aircraft lifted smoothly into open sky. Naomi felt the subtle pressure shift as altitude increased. 15 years earlier, she had felt a different pressure at a different gate. That pressure had been unspoken, rooted in assumption. Today, there was no pressure beyond physics. Across the aisle, a young woman studying aerospace systems glanced at Naomi's notebook resting on her lap. Excuse me, she said softly. Are you Naomi Carter? Naomi looked up calmly. Yes, she replied. The woman smiled with quiet admiration. I wrote my thesis on transparency integration in aviation, she said. Your work changed the framework. Naomi studied her gently. Frameworks are maintained by those who inherit them, she said. Do not admire them. Improve them. The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing the responsibility hidden within that sentence. Mid-flight, light turbulence prompted a seat belt advisory. Crew members moved through the aisle, confirming compliance without raised voices. Authority felt grounded. Present. Mature. Naomi observed how naturally correction flowed without confrontation. That was the final proof. After landing in Los Angeles, Naomi remained seated until most passengers exited. She rose quietly and stepped into the terminal without announcement. Outside, the California sun cast long shadows across the pavement. A Skybridge aircraft bearing the subtle verified respect inscription lifted into the sky behind her. She paused briefly to watch its ascent. Not as an owner. Not even as a departing executive. As a witness to continuity. Later that afternoon, in a modest conference room overlooking the Pacific coastline, Naomi signed the final documents transferring executive authority to Maya Collins. The signatures were simple. No applause. No press conference. Rachel stood nearby, observing with composed satisfaction. The system will continue, Rachel said softly. Naomi nodded. It must, she replied. That evening, Naomi walked alone along the shoreline, the sound of waves replacing the hum of engines. She considered how leadership had once required standing firm in a cabin charged with assumption. Now leadership required stepping aside so structure could function without her shadow. 15 years earlier, silence had been misinterpreted. Now silence was stability. The following morning, Naomi boarded one final routine flight as Chief Executive Officer. Seat 2A. Boarding pass scanned green. Verified. Confirmed. The attendant smiled and stepped aside. Ordinary. The aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into open sky. Naomi looked around the cabin one last time in this role. A diverse collection of passengers occupied their seats with quiet certainty. No one questioned belonging. No one hesitated at verification. That certainty was the legacy. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Naomi rested her hands lightly on the armrests and closed her eyes briefly. Leadership had never required shouting. It had required steadiness, correction without humiliation, accountability without spectacle, discipline repeated long enough to become culture. After landing, she stepped into the terminal and into a life beyond daily oversight. Aircraft continued to ascend behind her in measured intervals, their engines humming with reliable cadence. Verification continued in cabins across continents. Crew members confirmed assignments without assumption. Supervisors welcomed audit without defensiveness. The system endured, and in that endurance lay the final truth she had proven not through force, but through alignment. Dignity does not demand volume. It demands structure. When structure protects dignity, altitude becomes more than miles traveled. It becomes evidence that trust can be engineered, sustained, and passed forward long after the moment that first required courage.